Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait as everybody trickles in, and then we'll get this event started. I'm going to give a little bit more, a few more minutes or moments, a few more moments for people to trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us at this live virtual event. I'm your host. My name is Maris Fessenden, and I'm the communications manager for the nonprofit Adventure Scientists. But I'm also donning an old hat tonight because not so long ago, I was also a bookseller at the Country Bookshelf here in Bozeman, Montana. So I'm especially pleased to be able to host this event here on behalf of those two organizations, and I'm grateful to be in this virtual space here for Books in Common Northwest, which is an ongoing series with Country Bookshelf co-hosting with two sister stores, Madison Books in Seattle, Washington, and Paulina Springs Books in Sisters, Oregon. If you're curious about the Books in Common Northwest series, visit www.booksinCommonNorthwest.com for more information, and we have that link here in the chat. And you can also follow that page on Eventbrite and register for more great events in this series. And we also have a link for Country Bookshelf, so you can check out this wonderful bookstore on the main street of Bozeman, Montana that we all love. So to begin this event formally, I want to start with an acknowledgement that we are currently occupying the ancestral unceded lands of the Absaluka Crow, Salish Kootenai, Cheyenne, Shoshone Bannock, and the Oseti-Sakoan peoples, as well as many other peoples and groups who sought trade, travel, gathering, and healing in this place that we currently, for the moment, call Gallatin County, Montana. I'm giving this acknowledgement because Country Bookshelf and the other sister stores are places about stories and sharing stories and the impact of stories. I'm especially giving this acknowledgement tonight because we are gathered here virtually because we're interested in becoming better stewards of the land. And who better to learn how to be stewards of the land than the peoples who have stewarded the land for millennia. So I encourage any of you joining us from outside Montana, outside of Bozeman, to learn about the land that you occupy and learn about the stories of the people who live there and how you can work to build a healthy relationship with that land. Also, before we get to introducing our lovely speakers here, who you can all see their images, I want to give you some housekeeping tips about this virtual space we've created. We are recording the event, and it will be available in the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel. So you'll be able to check that out after this event. We're discussing we're focusing this discussion on one important book, Rescuing the Planet by Tony Hicks. We're also highlighting that there is the new Farmers Almanac 5 with an essay by Lauren E. Oaks, and you can see those books as well as Lauren's first book, In Search of the Canary Tree, on booksinCommonNorthwest.com, and then you can click on the logo of your favorite participating bookstore to purchase the books if you're interested. And you can also go to Country Bookshelf's website and purchase the books directly through there if you'd like. If, as we're discussing, you have any questions for our panelists, go ahead and submit them in either the Q&A feature that you'll see or the chat. If you do use the chat, make sure to switch the little blue button to say panelists and attendees so we can all see your question and not just the panelists. And we'll make every effort to get your questions answered in the time that we are together. If you run into any technical issues, we recommend you first try exiting the meeting and then entering back in. If you aren't able to re-enter, you can go over to the live stream of the event on the Books in Common Northwest YouTube channel. And if you're having any sound issues, we recommend trying headphones. That can help. Books in Common Northwest would also like to let everyone know that this is a shared and creative space, and we want it to remain safe for everyone. So we ask that you be respectful of everyone who has joined us tonight. Offensive or inappropriate comments or questions will see the user dismissed from the space. And I'm going to let you know that the order of events will be that I'm going to introduce our three panelists, and then Tony will take it away with a brief talk about his book. And then Greg and Lauren will host a panelist discussion with some questions that they have prepared. And then we will open it up to questions and answers from all of our attendees. So we'll get there. And we're so glad to have you here with us tonight. All right. Tony Hicks is the author of 15 books, including the award-winning The Experience of Place. He was a staff writer at The New Yorker for more than 30 years and was a visiting scholar at New York University for 25 and has lectured around the world. He lives in New York, and that's where he's coming to us tonight from, with his wife, young adult writer Louise Metzger. He is speaking to us tonight about his new book, Rescuing the Planet. Our two panelists that are also joining us include Lauren E. Oakes, a conservation scientist with the Wildlife Conservation Society, an adjunct professor in the Department of Earth System Science at Stanford University, and writer. Her first book, In Search of the Canary Tree, is a narrative science memoir about finding faith in the ability of people to cope with a rapidly changing planet. She also contributed to the new Farmers Almanac, Volume 5, the most recent volume of the eclectic biannual anthology from the Greenhorns, a grassroots network for recruiting, promoting, and supporting new American farmers. National Geographic named Greg Trinish Adventurer of the Year when he completed a 7,800-mile trek along the spine of the Andes Mountains. Since that accomplishment, he has channeled his passion for exploration and making a difference into Adventure Scientists, which is the conservation nonprofit that I work for. The organization provides researchers, institutions, land management agencies, and others with access to scientific data that can amplify and accelerate solutions to environmental and human health issues. We accomplish this through our volunteers. We recruit folks with outdoor skills, such as mountaineering, diving, whitewater kayaking, and then we train and equip them to collect and bring back hard to obtain data from the far corners of the globe. All right. Tony, please take it away.
Thank you, Maris. I'm delighted to be here in Bozeman at the Country Bookshelf. And thanks to Books in Common Northwest to be in Seattle at the same time. And in Sisters, Oregon, 3 great indie bookstores. And I want to thank Maris so much for presiding and writing her on the event tonight. It's an honor to be joined by 2 brilliant optimists about the future of the planet, Lauren and Greg. 3 optimists in one virtual place, that's almost unheard of. The perfect setting for talking about an urgent task, protecting half of all land and water to stave off the mass extinctions crisis. I'd like to just show you a few pictures, and then we can have a discussion. The book is sort of about what's sometimes called the other environmental crisis, as distinguished from climate change, but really, of course, they're twined together. 1 million species are at imminent risk of extinction. This is Sudan, the last male northern white rhino who died in Kenya a few years ago after his beloved keeper came in for one last rub behind the ear. The situation is so dire that we've had to coin a word I would hope we never would have needed, an endling. An endling is the last of its species. This is Lonesome George, the last Pinta Island tortoise in the Galapagos, who died a few years ago at the age of 101. One of the reasons we got into this trouble was because we had a very single-minded view of progress for a long time. This is an 1872 print called American Progress. Progress being that golden-haired young lady with not very many clothes on, who is floating over the continent as she moves from east to west, trailing telegraph wires behind her, accompanied by covered wagons, stagecoach, and trains. Now, I happen to like trains myself, but we seem to think in that mindset that you had to do one thing or another all at once. And in this case, it meant displacing the Native American population. It meant displacing and killing the buffalo. There's a snarling bear at the left-hand lower corner of the picture, as they are replaced by farmers and so-called civilization. But even while that was happening, some people began thinking beyond loss to a much larger picture. One of the first was a craggy New England forester named Benton Mackay, who, when he graduated from college in 1900, clambered up, bushwhacked up a mountain in Vermont called Stratton, shinnied up the tallest tree he could find, and surveyed the landscape, and was overcome by what he later called a planetary feeling, the sense that there was a single landscape around him and beyond him, stretching all the way along the peaks of the Appalachian Mountains from Maine to Georgia. A few years later, he published his essay proposing a footpath along the peaks of the Appalachians, the Appalachian Trail. This so inspired people that over the next 12 years, thousands of volunteers brought that footpath into being. It is still largely maintained to this day by volunteers, 2,190 miles long, passing through 14 different states. Mackay always talked about the trail as just the centerpiece of a much larger landscape that he called the Appalachian realm. This is the end papers map in my new book, Rescuing the Planet, showing the 4 largest landscapes in North America. We're very lucky to have lucky bones in this continent. We've got the Appalachian Mountains running down the East Coast, seen on the right of the map from top to bottom, paralleled by the Rockies in the west. As you can see, the Appalachians, the whole realm, is the smallest of the 4 landscapes. The one in the west had its own visionary, a Canadian activist and lawyer named Harvey Locke, who in the 1990s saw himself as in a single landscape that stretched all the way from Yellowstone Park up to the north end of Yukon. Yellowstone to Yukon, Y to Y was the name he gave it, and that group now has protected at least 21% of that landscape. Then across the top of the continent, almost unbelievably, the largest and most intact wild landscape left on the planet, the Canadian boreal forest. 3,700 miles long from east to west, 1,000 miles deep from top to bottom. Down at the bottom of the continent, of the US at least, the most recently identified large landscape, the North American Coastal Plain Biodiversity Hotspot. It's a good thing we started thinking big when we did, because even as early as the 80s, it was apparent that our traditional ways of protecting things and places and animals and plants just wasn't working. The national parks were leaking species, and as they began to have development around them, there was no way for this species to get back inside. This has gradually produced this half-Earth notion. It's probably the question I get asked most often. Why half-Earth? Well, in the 150 years after Yellowstone was created, the great American invention, national parks, we've only managed to protect about 15% of the landscape. And that seems to be enough only to guarantee the continued existence of a quarter or less of all the species around us. However, if we bump that up to 50%, there's a good chance we can save 85 to 90% of the plants and animals. Not everything, but almost everything. I'd like you to look for a moment into the fierce eyes of this Russian scientist, Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky. In the 1920s, he wrote the first definitive book about the biosphere, this layer of life that seems to contain everything living anywhere, as far as we know. And he pointed out that it has three characteristics. It's immeasurably old, maybe 3.8 billion years, if not older. It's enormous, seen side to side, but it has a third dimension. Its height, or rather its lack of height. Its thinness. Almost all of life seems to be contained within the 12.5 miles between the bottom of the ocean and the top of Mount Everest. 12.5 miles, if stretched horizontally, that would be a distance you could drive across in 20 minutes. Just think of it. You could drive the length of life in 20 minutes, from one end of life to the other. So that made it apparent that this biosphere, this layer of life within which we all exist, all species, is both incredibly robust and by its very nature, a precarious place. We've found some wonderful things as we keep exploring it from side to side. This spider was found in India just a few years ago and deliberately given the scientific name Areovixia gryffindori because they were convinced it looked just like the sorting hat in Harry Potter. And they thought maybe someone would begin to like spiders better if it was associated with Harry Potter. On the right is an African vulture that can actually fly so high that it once collided with a jetliner. But within this context, back at the half-Earth blackboard of robust, ancient, and thin, there seem to be 3 R's in order to keep things going. We have to retain what is still wild, we have to restore what was once wilder, and we have to reconnect places that have been severed. The Boreal Landscape, the most immense landscape on the planet, 85% still intact, in better shape than the Amazon or the Russian Siberian taiga. The Canadians have finally turned to their Native American population, the indigenous people of that enormous landscape who call themselves the First Nations. Canada had pledged to protect 17% of its landscapes by 2020, but it had fallen considerably behind. It was only at about 11%. Finally, they certainly have behaved badly towards the First Nations, but they never displaced them. They're still in place. They've been there for 10,000 years. They understand the land and the animals better than anyone. And now they are being asked to be the rangers of a whole new national park system, the indigenous protected landscapes, the indigenous protected areas. They can become the rangers from within, the mucklucks on the ground, as they're saying. And these indigenous protected areas are going to be far larger than existing national parks in Canada. The only other country that's taken on this role so far is in Australia, where Aboriginals are beginning to be the guardians of huge swaths of territory. So there's this invisible axis between Australia and Canada that now we in the lower countries of North America can begin to emulate. Old ideas are coming back in force as the urgency reaches people. I think it is the urgency that is beginning to be manifesting in all of us. People who've gotten been able to get into rocket ships and get above the planet look back and sometimes say they see how valuable and how vulnerable it is. It's called the overview effect. It's now beginning to manifest, I think, itself in us down here below, more of an interview effect. Anyway, as I was saying, some old ideas are beginning to resurface. This was the concept of what's called green line parks, which means parks that are considered special places but don't all have to be in public ownership. Another American invention, one we let get away from us. After World War II, the English decided it was time for them to set up a national park system so that they could create a land fit for the heroes who had fought in the war for England. All of their national parks are these so-called green line parks, special places, but largely in private ownership, such as the Lake District that was so beloved of William Wordsworth and so many other people. And now they've protected something like 30% of the country. Well, we thought it was time in the 1970s maybe to reclaim this idea, and National Park Service people drew up a list of landscapes that were treasured by the people who lived in them and came up with this, what I call treasure map. Well, you haven't probably heard about them because this was going to have been the great environmental initiative and legacy of the second Jimmy Carter administration. Only there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration because he lost to Ronald Reagan in 1980. But now, not only is the idea coming back, but a group on the Delmarva Peninsula, on the east side of the Chesapeake Bay, Delmarva because it's a tri-state area, it's part Delaware, Del, part Maryland, Mar, part Virginia, Va, have decided between them that they're going to protect 50% of that landscape by the year 2030. The English have a second system of parks called Areas of Outstanding Natural Beauty, AON, what is that? AON Natural Areas. Even they find it cumbersome. The people in the Delmarva Peninsula have shortened this to Outstanding Areas, or OASIS for short. It isn't just that we as people have a better understanding of the size of landscapes that need to be retained in order for animals and plants to be there with us. The animals are able to tell us that now too. Now that we can tag animals and track them, the co-founder really of Yellowstone to Yukon was a wolf named Pluie, who was captured near Banff National Park in the 1990s. She was tagged with one of the first satellite tracking collars. They thought, well, she'll probably move around a bit, wolves wander a bit. But then she disappeared off their scopes, and they thought, oh, well, that's science, back to the drawing boards. Several months later, they got a call from some NASA scientists down in the States saying, we've got your wolf here on our tracking. Well, it turned out that they had lost touch with Pluie because she'd wandered far beyond where they thought she possibly might go. And over the next 18 months, she traversed an area 10 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. Same kind of thing happened later in this century to Hall Sawyer, who was trying to track mule deer populations in Wyoming, tagged some 40 of them. They seemed to disappear too. Hadn't really disappeared, it's just they'd gone far beyond where he thought he'd find them. And it turned out there was this 150-mile migration every year, twice every year, of mule deer right under our noses, and we'd never even noticed. All of this is also now leading through the work of a brilliant German biologist, Martin Wikelski, seen here, to what he's calling the animal internet. They've now put some antennas up on the International Space Station. It'll be possible to track the movements of something like 300,000 animals all over the world simultaneously within the next couple of years or so. Well, now that we're used to thinking at larger scales, Travis Belote, a Wilderness Society biologist who's based right here in Bozeman, and his colleagues have decided to map the large landscapes that in the US that seem to be big enough to retain species and retain biodiversity and retain natural processes. And they've just about to publish in May this map of 74 landscapes stretched across the lower 48 states. Greater Yellowstone system, one of the first to be delineated, is among them. So is the crown of the continent up around Glacier. So is the greater Grand Canyon. But as you'll see, they really make an enormous arc, if not a circle, around the west that really extends down south across the country, then swings up into Benton MacKay's Appalachian realm. These 74 landscapes occupy 29% of the 48 states. So if 30 by 30, and by the way, half Earth or 50 by 50, the Biden administration has embraced, at least as an interim goal, the idea of protecting 30% of the US by 2030. Maybe that 30 by 30 won't be so hard to achieve because maybe it's ready-made. Interestingly enough, this was anticipated more than 100 years ago. The map on the right comes from an enormous and never published treatise called the National Plan, created by a brilliant, innovative landscape architect named Warren Manning. During World War I, his business slacked off. He decided he would plan the future of the states, and look at all the natural land he thought we ought to put aside, at least a third of the 48 states. And a lot of overlap with what Travis and his team and the animals they listen to have been telling us is needed. Among birders, there's a phrase, spark bird. It means that bird they first caught sight of sometime in their life that then they could never let go of the amazingness of, remains with them the rest of their life. They're tied to nature. But it doesn't have to be a bird, you know, it could be a wildflower, it could be a view. Greg likes to say it only takes 3 seconds to get reconnected. Or it could be swinging from a tree at the top of a mountain, the way Benton MacKay did. I really appreciate the chance to being with you and to be with Greg and Lauren. And traditional book signings are in abeyance for the time being, but there are these signed book plates, if you want them, that Country Bookshelf can send you with a book. And if you're interested in one that actually is made out to you yourself personally, just tell the people at the bookshelf and they'll send me your names and I will inscribe them and send them back to you. And now we can get back to talking amongst ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony.
I think Lauren and Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. So great to hear your story. I'll jump in with a question, and I've been thoroughly enjoying this read, and I feel like you do a beautiful job of weaving our present thinking and the challenges we're facing with, yeah, a real deep history. And there are characters, some I know from other conservation stories, and some that you have really brought to the foreground and woven together with a depth I just haven't seen before. So it's just a pleasure to read, and really a gift for many to read. I'd just love to hear a little bit about what's first sparked your interest in writing this book, and how did you navigate the process of, I guess, your craft. I think there's a lot of historical research as well as reporting that was involved.
Well, I guess it's been about 10 years in the making. And I guess what I was first sensing was just the plight of the animals. But I didn't know who was doing anything about it or what could be done about it. And I was lucky enough to make the acquaintance of the great Harvard biologist and biodiversity champion, Edward O. Wilson, at that point. And he was talking about, we've got to think bigger, we've got to think bigger. And in talking with him, I actually came up with the phrase half Earth, which he's since run with. And he said, and even back then, 10 years ago, it seemed like a wildly ambitious idea, 50%. But he said it's worth sometimes throwing out a nutty idea, just attract people's attention. That's what he said in the business world is called a BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. You just throw it out and it sort of shakes people awake sometimes. And sometimes it actually works. He said, for instance, President Kennedy saying, let's put a man on the moon in 10 years. And we did. But things have been moving so fast that and now it doesn't sound outlandish anymore to talk about it. If the Biden administration can already embrace the 30 by 30 goal, now we can even look beyond that. But meeting Ed and his infectious enthusiasm, and he began to introduce me to people he knew who were doing things. One of the most interesting of which was this guy down in the panhandle of Florida, self-made millionaire, who liked to think of himself as a dirt road panhandle guy, who had gotten hooked totally by accident. And someone who made his first stake playing poker for a living and then became a multimillionaire commodities broker. But one day he was stuck in traffic in Florida, fuming, frantic, looked out his window and saw on a high school billboard the sign, Black Bear Seminar. And he thought, anything is better than this. He peeled off, said he went inside, a couple of drunks sleeping it off, 3 or 4 Canadian tourists who'd gotten lost hoping for some day-old donuts, and up on the stage, 2 remarkable women talking about how we could rescue the Florida black bear, which is a subspecies of the black bear. And suddenly he was entranced. And he said the next day he wrote them a check for 2 more years of their work. And he said that alarmed them. No one had ever given them that kind of money before. And they said, what do you want? He said, well, what I really want is for you to give me a list of the 100 most important environmental books so I can get up to speed. Mm-hmm. He then spent a year reading those books and then saw his chance to restore the natural habitat of the Florida black bears, which was these beautiful woods, longleaf pine woods, which had been the signature ecosystem of that whole stretch of the country, but had largely disappeared after the Civil War, when it was chopped down by the defeated Southern plantation owners for cash. Is probably the reason why Scarlett O'Hara said, I will never go hungry again. So he bought up 51,000 acres of played out peanut farms and began replanting longleaf pine seedlings, 500,000 a year. By the time I caught up with him, it was 12 or 13 years later, it still looked pretty scruffy, but he said, but we're in year 13 of a 300-year project. MC unfortunately passed on a couple of years later, but he left behind enough of an endowment to complete the 300-year project. So through Ed, I met MC. Ed told me to come out to Bozeman so I could go out to Ted Herner's Flying D Ranch with Mike Phillips and see the restoration of the bison herds there. And we even got to see some wolves who'd wandered in and howl at them. And I began seeing that all over the continent were the people doing extraordinary things with incredible enthusiasm and with great success. That's why this became a hopeful book, because so many people are doing so much. It looks like here is a dire calamity that we actually can overcome and reach beyond. So that's the message of this book. Be of good cheer.
It's great. Tony, you got to travel and see so many different inspiring optimist like yourself, and as you led with, just I think we all share that on this call, that we still have a lot of hope for nature. I'm curious, in all your travels, and it sounds like the gentleman in Florida, and I know your experience at Flying D made it into the book as well. I'm wondering if you could speak even more broadly, with pristine seas protecting so much of the ocean, with the American Prairie Reserve trying to build the largest protected area in the lower 48. There's all these incredible different models. Benton Mackay's, where you've got these, 30-mile corridors. Is there one that really, if we're going to accelerate this as quickly as possible, if we're going to really seize on this opportunity, is there one that really stands out to you that is a model for the rest of us conservationists to look into or pursue?
Well, I think I'm afraid, Greg, I have to say all of the above. We have to accelerate them all simultaneously. The Mackay, you mentioned Mackay, and how the odd thing is it's 100 years since he announced the idea for the Appalachian Trail. And I think he would probably, if he were here, he would probably tell the wonderful people who've maintained the trail that their job 100 years later is half done. They've created and secured the trail, but the realm needs work. Securing the realm needs work. And maybe they need, well, the Appalachian Trail corridor, these things get complicated. The Appalachian Trail corridor as a secured wild landscape is only 1,000 feet wide. Some biologists out west have talked about the possibility of creating corridors that are at least 1.25 miles wide or 2 kilometers wide, saying that if you can secure that width, you can then be sure to have enough room both for a footpath for people and animal movement corridors. So that's part of securing the realm in the Appalachians. But maybe you can reach far beyond even that kind of corridor if you incorporate the Green Line Park idea of having a special landscape that will stay in private ownership, but where everyone is agreed that as it changes, it will change in ways that retain its specialness. So it's a mix and match as well as all of the above. And that's, I think, part of what's exciting is that people who've never had much to do with each other are suddenly becoming allies and partners. For instance, land protection people and trail people. Trail people have been mostly interested in walking and securing a place for walking rather than protecting the land. And I think that's why Mackay's vision has taken so long to reach its full achievement, because another guy sort of shouldered him aside in the 1930s and created the trail. And it was said he left 2 paths across the east. One was the trail and the other was a trail of bruised egos, but he got the trail built. Maybe it was the only way to do it. But now it's time to keep going. So it's a way of, architecture is changing. The idea that we can have green roofs, plants on roofs, even plants on walls, green walls. We're sort of beginning to speak. We came up a few years ago with the idea of universal design, which meant designing for all people, disabled people with disabilities as well as able-bodied people. Now we're moving beyond that to sort of all species design. How do we accommodate the needs of us and the rest of the species at the same time? I mean, what we're doing, that American progress picture, all species, or almost all species, seem to have a propensity for tinkering with the landscape and treating it as a fixer-upper. I mean, birds build nests, beavers build dams. Humans are much better at it and more preoccupied with it than anything else. And we sometimes mistake what we've made for the whole place. But now I think we're being able to see that expansiveness of the biosphere and that thinness of the biosphere all at once, and that's what leads us on.
I loved your message at the end. I mean, I feel like there's a big take-home message about there is a sense of urgency, and there is urgency to act now, all forms of action, like Greg has mentioned, but there's also there's space enough and there's time enough. And I think the maps you showed, I'm just thinking about them in relation to, there was a House Natural Resources Committee subcommittee meeting a few weeks back on building back better and talking about 2030. And a lot of the ideas there were trying to identify the places where this protection could occur. In your map, the one that Travis Bolote presented or is about to publish, shows a lot of large landscapes across the United States. And there's also a lot of other ideas that were presented at that meeting along tribal sovereign lands and ancestral homelands, on underrepresented and threatened ecosystems like coastal wetlands or grassland systems, on areas surrounding protected areas, like the buffer zones that currently contribute to the way our parks are managed and the way animals can migrate. But there's a message to me that there is so much that we can do, and there's lots of different forms of positive action moving forward. There's no perfect recipe. We do need them all.
It's a big stew. We've got to put everything in the pot. The other piece of good news is that anyone who's interested can get involved wherever they are, because wherever you are, you're in an ecosystem, and there's somebody doing something that you can either get involved at the macro level with groups like Ed Wilson's Half Earth Project, or Harvey Locke's Nature Needs Half, or
with Greg and Adventure Scientists.
or Greg is a venture scientist. But whatever your interest is, it's a simple Google search to find people who are already involved in doing something. Whether it's trail, well, I mean, the adventure scientist is the perfect example of putting together two things that seemed totally unrelated. And that's scientists doing research and robust people, athletes bouncing around the landscape. And Greg has, made them his eyes and ears. It's almost like tagging animals. Now people bounding across the landscape are reporting scientific data, doing the work that the biologists can't get out into these unreachable places except for these amazing people, and recording data and bringing it back.
I'd be curious to hear a little bit if you wanted to share about your experience in the Boreal region. It sounds like an area that you traveled to. I feel like a lot of attention to forests around the world goes to the tropical regions, and the intact forests around the planet suck up about 1/3 of the mankind's emissions each year. They're doing an enormous service by remaining. So I'm just curious to hear if you could share a little bit about the Boreal region that you visited.
Boreal's a great case in point, and it's hard for a city guy like me to begin to wrap my mind around a place like that, even after having been there. It's so big. You just go forever. I gather Dave Foreman went up there a few years ago and was flying across it. And tears came to his eyes, because just for mile after mile after mile, after hour after hour after hour, all you saw was the landscape, nothing else. But the Boreal's a good case in point because it's a place with two nicknames. It's called North America's Bird Nursery because literally billions of songbirds and shorebirds fly up there every spring to raise the next generation. But it's also called the Fort Knox of carbon because the amount of carbon locked up in those trees and that soil and that peat, if it were to be released all at once into the air, would be the equivalent of 37 years worth of fossil fuel emissions exploding into the atmosphere. So it's vitally important to all of us that it be retained the way it is. And the only way to do that is to enlist the First Nations and make them the official guardians of the landscape, not just the overlooked guardians of the landscape as they were for so long. So just in the nick of time, we've found fellow feeling with fellow human beings to make this possible.
Tony, I want to ask your thoughts. If you could just speak a little bit to, we're in a state where currently our state government is really pushing in the other direction, where we've got trapping or for wolves legal again. We've got wolves can now be hunted at night. There's all these new regulations coming down. This is certainly not an isolated example. You look at the border wall that Trump was building, and one of the biggest ecological catastrophes. And so I want to make sure we inject a little dose of realism here, that these are challenging, politicized, majorly difficult initiatives. And you do such a great job of highlighting all of these success stories around the world. What would you say about, I guess, the tides pushing in the other direction, or the challenges that we're facing here? And how do you reconcile that?
Well, it is a huge challenge, Greg. Of course it is. Just even mathematically, it's a huge challenge. We have to accelerate the pace of protection by something like 12 times what we've been able to do historically to reach a goal like 50 by 50. But in terms of the tide, it's a choppy tide, it's a rip tide. Yes, Montana is killing wolves again, but at the same time, in Colorado, they passed a referendum inviting wolves back just in November. So these things keep flipping around. One place suddenly lights seem to dim, but another place where lights haven't been so bright, they shine brighter. And I think we have to expect that choppiness to continue over the next 10 years at least. But meanwhile, the reason all these movements are having such success is that they are citizens-led movements. They are coming up from below. They're not being imposed by presidents or governors. The governors and presidents are being pushed by people who see the need and who are getting the work done. That's what it seems to me. I think that's been your experience too. Or someone like Lauren, who, my goodness, is devoting herself to the forests of the future. How farsighted can you get? It's an amazing time to be around.
I'd love to hear if anyone who takes a book length project, there's challenges along the way, and also kind of moments of epiphany or aha moments. You've written 15 books in your career, and this is the latest, but I'm curious if what were a couple aha moments in your research process, or maybe in your writing process, you might share.
The Boreal was so overwhelming. I don't think I had the breath left in me to say aha. But there's a tree in Massachusetts that was an aha moment for me. In the suburbs of Boston, this 500-year-old oak tree, the Waverly Oaks, and the last of them, and it had been, championed 100 years ago by a young landscape architect who was a disciple of Frederick Law Olmsted, named Charles Eliot, and that's where the land trust came from. He got the idea that there were still pockets of natural land around Boston as it was exploding in its growth, and that they could be protected like pictures in a gallery or books in a library, and become part of the legacy of a place. Well, there were 20 or more of these Waverly Oaks at that point. And he convinced people. They set up the first land trust in the world, the trustees of reservation in Massachusetts, to save these places, and they have been saved. Unfortunately, the Oaks were also at the end of the brand new trolley car line, and everyone came out from Boston to love them, and loved most of them to death by trampling around them. And there's only one still there, and it's been championed and saved by a wonderful U.S. conservationist named Jim Levitt, who lives in the area. And he led me to it, and there is this extraordinary tree that was there before the Pilgrims got there. And you can sort of sit down at its base and look up through its gnarled branches and think, well, it's good for at least another 100 or 200 years. Amazing. Here we are.
I think this is the section I've underlined last night. Can I read from it? The last paragraph? Is that okay? Can I read from it?
Please, please.
I thought it was beautiful. Surprisingly, it's as quiet as a library under the tree, and in a breeze, the branches overhead shift and the leaves shimmer like water bubbling in a fountain. Standing with my back to the great white oak, I looked out beyond the parking lot at Belmont, a 160-year-old suburban town. In that moment, it seemed like a town in its infancy, since it was honoring a commitment to protect something that may need 1,000 years to complete its lifespan. So maybe saving one old tree isn't setting aside half the earth for the rest of life, but simply standing beneath it can summon a planetary feeling. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I mean, I think that tree and the context of that tree shows how several things can happen at the same time. Belmont, much of Belmont is a very suburb-looking suburb. In fact, the tree is not far from what's called Car Wash Corner, but it's still there. And all you have to do, I think we're built to respond to places like this, because this is how we evolved as a species. And so we're attuned for them. And I think the aha moment may be when, on the behalf of the trees and the critters, when they realize someone's tuned into them.
Nice. Thank you. Greg, do you want to share a little bit about what Adventure Scientist is doing, in case there are people from the bookstore who might want to hear, or other people who haven't been engaged with Adventure Scientists before?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we are a nonprofit organization. We're based here in Bozeman. We operate all around the world, and our current projects are we are collecting genetic and chemical reference libraries for timber that is illegally harvested. This is a $150 billion a year issue, where $150 billion a year are stolen out of forests, making it impossible to manage them. And so we're collecting species by species the genetics and chemicals that isolate where a particular stand of trees has come from, so that at a mill or somewhere down the line, you can test that wood and determine within 30 kilometers now where those trees came from. It's really quite amazing. And then we are working on a project with the U.S. federal government and about 40 state governments on wild and scenic rivers. Over 40% of our wild and scenic waterways, these most pristine waterways that have been set aside for their natural and pristine nature, have never been tested for water quality. There's currently up in the Boreal in Alaska, as the permafrost melts, these rivers and creeks are turning orange and red, and fish are dying, and it's unclear exactly what's causing that. So I'll be headed up there to test that water, and we have a number of volunteers across Alaska that are testing that water as well. But that's a great example of these little micro stories, I think, that develop in these, where another is in the Ventana Wilderness in California. This is an area that burned just a few years ago, one of the devastating wildfires there, and it hasn't been reopened to recreation until just this month, now years later after those fires. So we'll be able to test water quality in there to determine how safe it is for people to be back in there, and assisting the state government in being able to do that, because all of these state governments are underfunded across the country, across the world. These data sets just wouldn't get collected. It wouldn't be possible without a volunteer army to keep costs down, but also in many cases, even the mandates of things like the Clean Water Act can't be enforced It's just impossible to do, and have the resources in order to make it happen. So that's where Adventure Scientist steps in. And
Wow.
Lauren, I'll give you the same prompt too. Do you want to talk about your work at WCS and what you've been
Please.
doing there?
Please do.
So I'm in the Forests and Climate program at WCS, and we work a lot in forest protection and forest restoration around the globe. The main target of our work internationally has really been in this intact forest protection movement that if we get into the nitty gritties of it, there's a lot of economic incentives to help with restoration and avoided deforestation. So like in places where land is likely to be cleared, then there's funding mechanisms to help avoid that deforestation. But when we think of protected lands and national parks and around the world, a lot of those places are still experiencing some level of degradation. And there's a lot of intact forests that are still not part of the protected base. So our initiatives are really trying to amp up investment in protecting them right away, giving them helping for long-term management of those ecosystems. But I work mainly in climate adaptation and mitigation. So I'm helping with those projects that'll have both benefits for communities through the many services that those forests provide, and also benefits at a global level to the carbon sequestration. That's kind of a quick summary, but we're definitely on the mission to help protect this base around the planet right now.
Well, Lauren just wrote a great piece in Scientific American about mangrove restoration project. And what was it? Something like they are able to store carbon at a rate that's something like 50 times the amount that Amazon rainforest stores?
Yeah, mangroves are incredible. But I think in general, the topic has been of interest to me because we've entered also the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is kind of another, landmark of showing there's a huge global movement to move in that direction of more restoration projects and forest protection. But the piece is also looking at, when those investment dollars are coming in, whether it's through philanthropy or for government funding, what does it really take to do that work well? And a lot of times we're thinking about, okay, here's the number of trees planted, or let's strive for a number of trees planted or a number of trees protected. But a more holistic approach, really takes into account the people, local communities, making sure that these projects benefit livelihoods in the places where they're occurring. Because, about 35% of the world's intact forests have indigenous people and communities living and relying upon them. So that's a really key part, is maintaining that relationship moving forward. But yeah, it's been pretty neat to get involved, not only in the projects in the US, but also now internationally.
That's why I was so thrilled that this forum allowed me to talk to people like Greg and Lauren. When three optimists get together, I don't know what can stop people. It was Benton Mackay who said, optimism is oxygen.
Yeah, and I guess my take has been similar to what we were saying earlier on, is that there's so much, you can look at these issues as, oh, this is super overwhelming. Look at the climate trajectories. I think of David Wallace Wells, who wrote The Uninhabitable Planet, which was a pretty dark outlook. But I, on the other hand, just think that we need all these solutions, and there's so many in front of us that, every piece and every contribution counts. So I tend to think about it as there's really so much that we can do, that people can do every day. And the contributing factor, what is to ask myself each day, like, in what ways can I help out? But I also want to ask others to do that, because I think we all have a different answer to that. Like Greg's answer is different than my answer, is different than your answer, but we kind of need them all.
Yes. And even more.
Absolutely.
And more. Yesterday and hopefully tomorrow.
Yeah, I do love this combination of technology and big, bold ideas that you put forth, Tony, in the book. I was reading yesterday in some citizen science journal about people tagging monarchs, and I was just thinking about your what you mentioned on the International Space Station, now being able to track 300,000 animals simultaneously around the globe. Things like that are technology is really accelerating fast, as it always has been under Moore's law, and
Well,
the idea that we can combine solutions and technology and these big bold ideas is very optimistic, and it is exciting.
very, and the fact that the technology is now letting us listen to the animals tell their story,
Yeah.
instead of imagining what we think they have to say. Really, that kind of tracking technology, and now that we've miniaturized so much what we can place on an animal, so we can track tinier and tinier things, and the tinier you get, the more of them there are. It's really one of those transformational technologies like the microscope or the telescope.
For sure.
And it's now making the research is now, just as you've been able to extend research to people going out in the landscape, we've been able to extend research. We're partnering with the animals and the plants and helping them tell us what it is that we all need to do in order for all of us to stick around.
The microbes are next. We need to learn to listen to the microbes.
I haven't tagged them yet, but they've certainly been telling us a lot of things over the last year that we haven't wanted to hear, but we're listening now.
When I was interviewing someone for the piece I wrote in Scientific American, it was a lead at the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And I was asking him about monitoring costs, because a lot of times, projects will say, that adds a lot to their project cost of planting trees or tracking the benefits to communities, or anyways, his aspiration and the UN Decade's aspiration was really focused on how do we make that free and how will technology enable that moving forward. And I think there's, obviously on the biophysical side, there's a lot people are doing with remote sensing and drones and other imagery. But I think on the social side, we'll see a lot of innovation there too, which is exciting to see moving forward.
Well, I hope people will want to read Rescuing the Planet, discreetly displayed.
Yeah.
Oh,
there we go. It's Ellen.
I don't have my here. It's on my phone.
He's on audiobook.
I did audiobook. I cheated. I don't know if that's cheating or not, but.
As one reason I wrote the book is to help everyone get up to speed quickly, now that we're being challenged to do so much in such a short amount of time. Oh, thank you.
There you go. Well, hold it.
And also,
I just wanted to put out a call into the attendees. If anyone has a question, feel free to ask, and we can make sure that the panelists get a chance to answer your question. But otherwise, they're having great conversations, so I'm going to let them keep going.
And again, selfishly, don't forget that if you do buy the book through Country Bookshelf, you can get a bookplate signed by the author. And if you want one, you can get a bookplate that's inscribed to you, dear reader, just by letting the Country Bookshelf people know. That would be my pleasure.
And I'll also add that there's the
yes,
the new Farmers Almanac as well, which is a really beautiful book. It's got illustrations and comics and beautiful writing. And between these two books, you're sure to, and also Lauren's first book, In Search of the Canary Tree, you're sure to be inspired to have hope and do something yourself. So
an award-winning book. Definitely worth getting.
Thank you. I will just say a little bit about this. It is a beautiful collection of writing. It's poetry in it. There's essays from activists, from biologists, from academics and researchers and farmers. But really the call for it was submissions looking at what is our vision for the future, and how could we create a more sustainable relationship with land moving forward. And it obviously was incredibly timely and then came out in pandemic times. It has a beautiful opening, but yeah, there's just it's a nice piece to pick up if you're interested in this topic, because you can pick up a number of different essays throughout it and whatever speaks to you, because it's pretty comprehensive. But
Lauren, what was your essay in it about?
I wrote about Alexander Mather, who was a Scottish geographer, and he was one of the first scientists to coin the term forest transition. So speaking of optimism, it's when a forest transition is when a country is shifting from a deforestation, net deforestation, to net increase in forest cover. And he was someone who worked, extensively on the topic in the 70s, 80s, and was very much thinking ahead to what we would see at this time. So I've been working on a book about the role that forests can play in combating the climate crisis, and it was part of the historical research that I was doing to look at where have we seen like real shifts in history from deforestation to reforestation, and what led to them. He's deceased now, but I ended up interviewing a lot of the people that worked with him as graduate students and students over the years, and his son, and I would have loved to have gone there to track things down, but did a lot remotely.
One of the questions I begin to raise towards the end of the book is next steps, which is the kind of thing I think we're talking about, because Lauren and Greg are clearly involved in things I didn't have time even to include. They're so recent. But one idea is that we're sort of creating an overall force field for protection. The work that's being done in Chile down there to protect millions of acres of national parks and connect them together. The fact that Antarctica is at least under some kind of formal international protection. Mikhail Gorbachev, of all people, some years ago had the idea of protecting the Arctic as an international place of peace. If we had both poles putting out pulses of protection, I think we would all begin to feel like we were connected up in a way that hasn't seemed possible before. My book largely writes about North America because we've been lucky enough to invent the national park here and invent the Green Line Park here. And so I hope we can again help lead the way. But this is, of course, something that has to happen on all 7 continents to work. We said that Australia is at least pioneering, working with its Aboriginal citizens to protect huge amounts of land that never had proper management before. And Australia is such a wild place. They at one point imported camels because they thought they would be good pack animals, and then they weren't such good pack animals, and the camels ran away. And then now something like 1 or 2 million feral camels just clomping around Australia and not doing right by the landscape. So there are extraordinary problems all over the place, but I just feel like people are coming into a kind of alignment that didn't exist before, partly because of the urgency, but partly because we're realizing we can work together in ways that are profitable as well as enjoyable. And it's only going to work if we all of us work together. So it's a kind of good news about the good news, that it's summoning us, if we wish to be summoned, into this partnership.
I'd just be curious to hear about how you constrained geographically. You did focus largely on North America, but in your process, did you think about writing in other regions at any point in time, or it was always going to be North America focused?
Well, it was Ed Wilson who said, you know, you'll never get the book written if you try to take on all 7 continents at once. So
Yep.
start with where we are, us parochial Americans, and show at least what we can do, how that will fit in with what everyone else can be doing, and make the case for 50 by 50, which is what I think I try to do.
Yeah. Some of our work at WCS has been targeted at what they call HFLD countries, so high forest, low deforestation. These are countries that have a really remarkable intact base right now, yet not a lot of degradation or driving impact, although it's could be impending, I'll say. So these are regions in Panama, Colombia, DRC, Peru, Belize, Gabon, Guyana, Suriname. And I think of those as also places now where it's a huge opportunity to have an enormous impact because of what's intact there, because there isn't an immediate driver of deforestation. And yeah, it's just, I'm thinking about it in relation to the map you showed of across the US of these places, you know, because we could do a similar thing and other researchers have around the planet of where are the high priority places now that we really need to invest for better forest protection and for permanent protection.
And so many of those places, Lauren, have indigenous populations too, right?
That's right, for sure.
Who could be the stewards and guardians of those landscapes as they get protected.
Exactly, yeah.
I have a question from Jessica, who writes, I love the thread of connection that runs through the book and this program. What kind of connections would you recommend working towards in these sort of scarier political, sociological spheres, particularly with shifting views of space between urban and rural communities? And given what you just were talking about, I guess, between indigenous and non-indigenous communities as well.
Well, that's a great question. Thank you. I think we're finding that landscapes often are less, how can I put this, less severed than you might think. I was just talking to people in New Canaan, Connecticut, which is a very affluent suburb of New York City. And they've set up something called a pollinator pathway. And that is the idea, not only that if people begin to devote part of their lawn to plants that attract butterflies and birds, this makes a big difference, but that you can think of yourself as part of a continuum of such places in all the towns around, reaching up out of Connecticut into New York State, that it's not fanciful to think that it's a real pathway, even though it's just you doing something in your lawn. And I've seen another estimate that if this really caught on and people devoted half, all across the country, half of their lawn space to the kind of planting that would increase biodiversity, something like 20 million acres of land would be returned to biodiversity purposes while still being part of people's suburban lawns. The opportunities are just so tantalizing and calling out to us wherever we are. So that map showed greater ecosystem landscapes. There's also maps of planners by urban planners showing mega regions of cities coming into being. One of the first was so-called BOSWASH, Boston to Washington corridor. But even within there are gaps, as I discovered. There's a landscape of wild forest that runs pretty continuously from the White Mountains of New Hampshire down to the Atlantic coast. And it's in between the New York urban region, which reaches up into Connecticut and Massachusetts, and the Boston Providence region. And here is this land that nobody had given a name to, so I decided to call it White Mountains to Whitecaps, or W to W, taking Harvey Locke's Yellowstone to Yukon and Y to Y. These possibilities are just everywhere. I can't say it enough without sounding ridiculous, but they are just everywhere.
The concept that the landscapes are more connected than we realize too, that resonates so deeply with me, having walked across continents, literally, including on the Appalachian Trail. It's just that it really is amazing how connected everything is. From, if you follow a river downstream, you're going to hit a town, and then if you climb up the next range from that town, you're going to get back up into the top of the mountains, and it's these wild, vast landscapes that are connected through these threads of water and occasionally roads and trails and all of these things. And I know you're talking about the airborne and pollinators in this case, but it really is amazing how connected we all are. And the idea that I can leave my house here in Bozeman and walk south and end up with those same people that I spent time with in South America, and that's entirely possible today to do. People are doing it. It's pretty cool.
That's right. Greg is a through hiker on the AT. A noble band of people.
Lauren, sorry. Lauren is an amazing adventure scientist too. We need to acknowledge this. Lauren and I met because I joined her in Southeast Alaska when she was doing her PhD work on yellow cedar, Alaskan yellow cedar. And we did an amazing 3-week kayaking adventure. But Lauren has been a guide and working in Glacier Bay National Park and all around Southeast Alaska, and has done some pretty incredible adventures herself.
Very cool.
I think I'm still thinking about the last question you read, because my other response to it would be, I mean, I feel like it comes full circle to where you started today, in acknowledging the history of our land and the people that have lived here, and I guess I get stuck on the use of we when we say who is we and we need to do. Who is we referring to? Because I think moving forward, we needs to be as inclusive as possible of people of the past and people of the future. And that, you know, some of these, a lot of the areas that we've talked about today have, cultural history, people's livelihoods attached to them. What we think of, what we think of as protection needs to be about creating a more, sustainable relationship. And not necessarily, think relying upon like a boundary or a limit, because those boundaries or limits don't exist. So I guess I also think holistically that a lot of the steps moving forward need to come from, shifting up everyone's relationship to nature in a more sustainable way. And there's a lot that we can learn from other cultures of the past that, and still today, that do that better than those who have settled.
I'm just thinking again that there are connections we don't suspect either. In New York City, you can actually get on a train and go directly to the Appalachian Trail. Mm-hmm. There's a suburban train stop up in Dutchess County where the track actually crosses the trail at right angles. And because a former president of the railroad was a hiker, he established a little whistle stop there. And so 3 or 4 trains on Saturdays and Sundays, if you ask them to, will stop there and let you off. And there you are on the Appalachian Trail. And you can get back on in the afternoon, and there you are again, Grand Central Station. So that's the kind of connectedness, I think. If, say, the Appalachian realm of Mackay's vision has the potential for being the Central Park of Eastern US, that means it has to be available to people on the cities on the East Coast. And it has to be available to cities on the other side of the Appalachians, the cities of the Midwest, the line of cities there. And part of what's making that possible is that paralleling the AT now is something called the East Coast Greenway, which is coming up the East Coast through urban and suburban areas, all the way from Florida to Maine. And paralleling to the west is another hiking trail. So you've got sort of 3 footpaths, and in the case of the East Coast Greenway, there's also bicycling coming north-south. And the next challenge will be to sort of put spokes in this ladder by having trails running east-west that will connect it all up and begin to give people a sense of that as a unit. The same kind of thing can happen if the Pacific Crest Trail and the Continental Divide Trail begin to think in terms of connecting landscapes as one of their purposes, which is something Benton Mackay in his 80s or 90s tried to interest the then Secretary of the Interior in 1965. He was given a pat on the shoulder and saying, thank you for your service, and told that we're already taking care of that, but they weren't really listening. It's only now beginning. And think of that. Here's a guy who was born in the 1880s and whose ideas are just beginning to resonate with people today. Some of them.
It seems like the vision of the Western Wildway Network and Eastern Wildway Network as well, Soulet's vision of these connected landscapes from Mexico to Canada. You know, it sounds like the two of them would have gotten along well.
Very well.
We have another question from Estefania. Sorry, Estefania. I'm struggling with her name, but it's my fault. All right. Indigenous people, the true stewards of the earth, get their rights violated daily and more heavily year to year. Standing Rock being a most recent example in the U.S. of a failed resistance to the government and big business. How can we guarantee Indigenous people's rights and lives be respected?
Well, in Canada, as I said, it's happening more because of need than anything else. The Anglo and French Canadian population really only stopped being horrible to the First Nations within the last generation. Before that, they had to go to these residential schools that were supposed to be taking their culture away from them. But in our country, where so many of the First Nations have been physically displaced, there are some opportunities. I think if Bear Ears gets restored to its previous size, there's the possibility for co-management there with Park Service types and Indigenous rangers. And we can start to look around for other opportunities. I've so much appreciated what Maris said at the beginning of our show about the peoples of the area who were there and who were the first inhabitants, and how even if they're not always in place, they are still to be learned from and welcomed back. It's part of this, there's so many shifts going on at once. The fact that for the first time in the history of the US, we have a Native American cabinet member, a Secretary of the Interior. Hundreds of years after we shooed them away, we've welcomed them into the president's cabinet, at least one of them, remarkable woman. And things are seeping as well as marching along. So again, I think we've got a huge amount of work cut out for us. We're only just beginning. You know, we done wrong by two populations: the ones we pushed aside and the ones we grabbed and brought over here to work for us. And we're only just beginning. Social justice is only just beginning to bring us to terms with that. Mm-hmm. But it's all happening at once in ways that I can't remember seeing at this kind of pace. My dad was part of FDR's New Deal, which he considered the most exciting time of his life. But I think he would be astounded at the pace things are moving at now. The challenge in New Deal days, of course, was that 1/3 of the country was out of work. But now it's like the land itself is calling out to us in addition to the people. So it's a new kind and different kind of urgency. And one of the things that I hope they are going to be able to create is this sort of reconstituted CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, way of enlisting young people to go to work on the land and for the land. That was such an extraordinary experience and one of the best things the New Deal was able to bring about. And one of the reasons why so many state parks and national parks around the country still have wonderful trails and lodges, because the kids in those days just were there and doing it. They were the adventure scientists of their day and left a remarkable legacy.
Thank you.
Other questions from the audience?
Please pepper us.
Yeah. Tony, it's almost
Don't have
11
any
o'clock
more.
where you are.
I know.
It's almost supper time, yes.
We don't have
You
any more
East
questions in
Coasters.
the queues, but I'll give people a few more minutes.
I think I might also just add to Stefania's question about Indigenous rights and guaranteeing. And guaranteeing is the same thing as protection. It's like, how can we get to that forever state or afar? Like it's the highest standard, right? But I feel like all those examples Tony gave are moving in a good direction. And I think another thing that's been interesting to see in recent years is the particularly in climate and fire related issues, like the new sharing of Western knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, or more applied sharing, maybe is what I'd say. The New York Times ran a piece earlier this year about turning to Native communities for really to learn about Native history of fire management, because there's a long history of knowledge there that far extends what we've ever collected through the Forest Service or understood on that time scale for the American West. So I think those are also some new models moving forward of working together by incorporating not just Western science but other forms of knowledge and knowing.
Oh, that
And holding them with equal weight. I mean,
Totally. Yeah.
That's what you're saying, but it's not just consulting with them or getting their perspectives, but holding those methods and values with equal weight for probably the first time in modern history.
Mm-hmm.
At least equal weight.
At least I was going to say, yeah, or leadership. Yeah.
But that reminds me, one of the people I got to meet when I was working on my book was this wonderful forester named Bill Finch, who's rescuing a forest down in the Cumberlands in northeast Alabama. And he points out that on this one hillside he took me around, there are something like 14 or 15 species of oak that you can, just by turning around 360 degrees, see all at once. And he said, one of the problems that the white people who came over from the European people who came over was that Europe in some ways was a much more impoverished landscape. There were only 4 or 5 species of oak. So they weren't equipped to recognize abundance of that nature. And by not listening to the Native Americans, there was no way they could get back up to speed properly. Also, he said, there are lots of seasons. Europeans are used to 4 seasons, but in many parts of the US, there are lots and lots of seasons. And we've only so far recognized a 5th season up in New England, mud season, in between winter and spring. But there are many others that we could give names to and give proper respect and feeling to. And all this knowledge was shoved aside because these ignorant savages didn't know the first thing about anything. They tried to tell us, we wouldn't listen. We're listening now because we gotta, because the place was going to rack and ruin without them. So I find that kind very refreshing that Bill is re-engaging that knowledge at that kind of level. And he's also working with historically Black colleges to bring kids out into the landscape to be the interns that are working with him. So a lot is just brewing.
One last question, and then I'll have us wrap up. Joan has asked, can you speak about human population? I'm old enough to remember it was an issue back in the late 60s and 70s.
Well, it is an issue. And I think we have to realistically expect that the US, for instance, will probably have another 100 million people in it in 50 or 60 years before we sometime reach a peak population and begin to decline. And we have to make room for them. So the way it's even going to be even more important as these decades go by, how we grow. And so the two landscapes, the human landscape and the landscape can coexist. Yeah, it's real, for sure. But it's, again, not something that we can't handle because there are so many ways of growing in ways that don't make it harder for the animals and plants. I saw, I think, was it piece in High Country News recently about interviewing Robert Liberty, who's a great planner in the state of Oregon. And Oregon, under a Republican governor some years ago, adopted a statewide plan of urban growth boundaries around every town and city. And it's been remarkably successful and bought into by people who call themselves conservatives and call themselves liberals. So his voice was now being heard up in the mountains for the first time. We'll see what kind of response and reception it gets.
Yeah, I'll add to that. There's really exciting new technologies coming out too that are going to help feed 12 billion people or 11 billion people, wherever the peak actually is. And we worked on a project, one of our very first ones at Adventure Scientist. We collected some fungi off the top of Mount Everest, which today have consistently inoculated and doubled crop yields across more than 3 million acres every year. Taking these fungi and having them symbiotically exist with crops. And another that we're just starting to develop is a project with crop wild relatives. So this is a huge new push for people to go out and find the wild relatives of a very limited number of species. Tony, you probably know more about this than I do, but there's something ridiculously small, like 28 species that feed over 80% of the entire planet.
Right.
28 species. And so there's this huge push to go out and find their wild relatives. So if you took corn or you took rice and you look for those wild relatives that are more able to grow in drought or frost or whatever it might be, you can take the genetics from those and use them in crops to make them more resilient to climate change and able to increase yields on the same amount of land. And I think there's so much in that. I mean, we need to feed people, and that's not going to change. But the more we can get out of each acre of land, when we look at restorative agriculture, when we look at carbon sequestration in soils, when we look at that restoration that's happening from, TNC's got programs of restorative cattle grazing and what American Prairie Reserve is doing with bison. And there's so many different really cool pushes and technologies that are coming into play that are going to help our species persist. And, that's not the answer alone. We have to protect these places. We have to do the all of the above approach, which you've captured so well here, Tony. But there is really exciting opportunities to reduce the impact that our species has on this planet.
Yes, and there's a movement called freeze the footprint of food, meaning don't take up more land to grow the more food we're going to need.
Yeah.
At the same time, I just was reading about someone who's discovered that seagrass has these incredible seeds which are more nourishing than rice or wheat. And talking of technology, Google Earth has just put online this extraordinary backlog of images of the whole planet every year from 1984 to the present, showing how things have changed both by themselves and because of human impacts, which also then makes it possible to sort of scenarioize the future. If growth continues in its current form, here's what the place will look like. If it takes an alternate form, here's what it could look like. So again, technology boosting our abilities to think more clearly, rather than just eat more.
All right. Thank you so much, Tony, Lauren, Greg. This is a great discussion. I'm enthused and inspired, so I hope others are as well. So getting thank yous in the chat from some of our attendees. So please feel those, they are heartfelt.
Thanks for bringing us together. It was a pleasure, Tony and Greg.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you, Maris, Lauren, Greg, and everyone. And yes, there's the little book. Please feel free to buy it.
Please support our hosts. Buy a couple books.
And if you must get the audiobook, buy it through Country Bookshelf.
If you must. Is a wonderful audiobook app. It's really enjoyable, and you can get all sorts of audiobooks through there, including Rescuing the Planet. So I recommend it.
Say the name of the app again.
It's called Libro FM.
Nice. Okay.
And,
yeah, you put it in there. Great.
It was linked in the chat as well.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night, all.
Take care.
Good night, everyone.